Well, in the context of the U.S. Supreme Court analyzing whether this statute is overbroad as applied to the January 6th protesters, there were protests that happened all across the country in terms of pro-Palestine over the weekend with the Iran attack against Israel. And why aren't those protesters being construed by the DOJ with, some kind of statute to impose a 20-year prison sentence? Well, joining me now to discuss is our Legal Eagle panel, Mike Donnelly, who is a law professor and attorney, and Ron Coleman, who is an attorney and the host of Coleman Nation podcast, and you're with the Dillon Law Group. So, gentlemen, before we get to the protests of the pro-Palestine, I want to ask you about Justice Thomas, because reports yesterday were that he was absent from the bench, but the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice didn't give any explanation, and then he was just back today, business as usual. Ron, does that indicate anything we should be concerned about?
Not necessarily. I was in front of the Second Circuit yesterday, and hear ye, out come the judges. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. One of them had to go to a funeral. They promised us that she would listen to the transcript, and the Second Circuit doesn't really matter. They not even listening to oral argument, as far as I can tell. But, people have private lives, including Supreme Court justices, and there could be a million reasons. Listen, there is no single life that's more important than that of Clarence Thomas. Certainly, in general, and every life is important, and all the things, but he's got to stay healthy. So I understand everyone's concerns, but he was back today, and it's fine federal, evidently. It's life.
Yeah, and I think we can all agree that we want to protect Justice Thomas. May he live forever. So, Mike Donnelly, to Ron's point, though, he was made aware of the reason for the absence of the judge on his panel. Why wouldn't the Supreme Court just indicate if there was something that Justice Thomas needed to attend, or a reason for his absence? But they have at least said that he will take part in the opinion, which probably means that he will read the transcripts or listen to the argument and then participate in the opinion.
Well, Justice Thomas is the longest serving Supreme Court justice, and I agree with Ron. In my opinion, one of the most important thought leaders on the court. He is bringing theories and ideas that our country needs to listen to in terms of returning to a federal republic and reinstituting constitutional jurisprudence. When I heard that he was off the bench for no explanation yesterday, I started praying. I said, we need Justice Thomas to return, and I'm so glad that he was back on the bench today. Look, why did they not make a pronouncement about his reason? I mean, look, why should they? I don't think Justice Thomas needs to explain every time he's not on the bench. None of them should have to either. They are private people, and they should be given some of that privacy. They certainly need protection, though. And, we need to make sure we're protecting them. And I did do, in my research, I noticed that some of the opponents of the court are digging through U.S. Marshal records to try and figure out where the justices are going. And it was interesting to note that Justice Thomas and Justice Roberts in the last 4 or 5 years have not been using the Marshal Service, maybe for that reason. And if I were them, that's what I would continue doing. I don't want people tracking my movements either, and I don't think we necessarily have to track every single one of the Supreme Court justices' movements if they're going on vacation somewhere or what have you. Clearly, there's ethical obligations that we need to be aware of, and I believe most of them, if not all of them, are doing that. I mean, I trust Justice Kagan to adhere to her ethical obligations just like Justice Thomas. So that's good call on Justice Roberts and Justice Thomas on maintaining their privacy.
Well, we are grateful that he's back on the bench. And so let's turn to the pro-Palestine protests. And there was a lot of violence yesterday. And so this tweet coming from Colin Rugg on X yesterday, just in, pro-Palestine protesters have stormed the Brooklyn Bridge and are blocking traffic, with one protester reportedly waving a Hezbollah flag. The incident comes after protesters blocked off the Golden Gate Bridge in California and lanes outside the Chicago airport. Earlier in the day, some protesters were heard shouting "Death to America," with one protester burning an American flag in New York City. So, Ron, obviously this is heinous behavior, this is criminal behavior, but it doesn't seem like the DOJ is looking into various statutes to try to construe the highest possible penalty that they possibly could, like they are with the January 6th protesters. So why not?
Well, it makes a lot of sense for them not to be looking for the harshest penalty, because they're not arresting people. So you don't have to look for penalties when you're not enforcing the law. these should not be called pro-Palestine protesters. These are pro-Hamas protesters, but more importantly, what they really are is anti-America protesters. This has gone far beyond any interest in into Gaza, into Israel. The language they're using, the cause they're espousing, is anti so-called colonialism, which means anti. There is no real meaning to the word colonialism here. In fact, the Muslim world, as we know it, is the product of an extremely successful colonial campaign that was undertaken over many centuries. No one's rolling back colonialism. The interest here is in undermining American institutions and capturing and moving the Overton window, so to speak, as to what level of radical left protest and violence and disturbance of American institutions and life will be permitted under the guise of a cause that has a certain amount of public appeal for cultural reasons that we probably don't need to go into right now.
Well said that it should be anti-American protests. So, Mike, your thoughts, and we've got about a little over a minute left.
These are not protests. These are criminal gatherings. They should not be permitted. I did see a few people in the New York case getting some handcuffs put on them, which was the right thing to do. I felt very bad for the folks trying to get to Chicago O'Hare Airport. NYPD, good for them.
FBI,
put some handcuffs on people. NYPD putting some handcuffs on people there. I didn't see the Chicago guys putting handcuffs on those people interrupting O'Hare Airport yesterday. I saw the cars just parked there protecting the protesters, but they're not protesters. They're just getting in the way. The First Amendment, and I love a good protest. I've been to them. I'll shout, I'll hold a sign too, and I'm all good with, blowing whistles and things like that, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but you can't disrupt your fellow citizens like that. That's not a protest, and that's not what the purpose of freedom of assembly was intended to protect. So stop doing it. Go to City Hall, hold your signs, make your noise. If you want to close down a public thoroughfare, arrange in advance. All the parades, they get permits. You can't do that. It's not a protest. Stop doing it.
Yeah, well, and hopefully America will decide to enforce our laws and have this balance, between what genuinely is First Amendment expression and protected conduct versus what is obviously just criminal activity. But we'll be right back with more. Gentlemen, of course, the biggest trial going on right now is the sham, ridiculous trial out of New York State of Donald Trump. And this headline coming from the BBC, because maybe they're a little bit less biased than some of the other mainstream media. We'll get to NPR later in the program, guys. But this headline coming from BBC: Trump trial, dozens of jurors rejected as they say they cannot be impartial. Dozens of potential jurors have been ruled out of Donald Trump's unprecedented criminal trial in New York on impartiality grounds. Mr. Trump denies falsifying business records to conceal a hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels just ahead of the 2016 election, which he won. 60 of the 96 potential jurors were quick to say they could not be impartial after proceedings began on Monday. And jury selection continues on Tuesday. So it continued today and could take up to 2 weeks. So, Mike, I'm actually surprised that it would only take 2 weeks. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump is very well known. Everybody has a feeling about him. And so can we get to any sort of impartial and constitutionally sufficient jury in this case?
Well, I hope so. Trial by jury is one of the most important parts of our criminal justice system. I do note that the Trump team did try to move the trial to another place where they thought they could get a better jury. I think it's going to be hard for them to get a impartial jury where they are right now. But even if we can just get one or two people who are willing to be impartial, they might be able to see justice done in this case. And when you think about this case, I wonder if people even realize what we're talking about here. The news, and if you look at Google, it's like NBC, ABC, blah, blah, Politico. You got to really look down to find any neutral analysis. And so I went and I read the indictment again. And they talk about, 34 felony counts. It's the same charge of allegedly falsifying business documents. And it's a felony only because, he's hoping to prove a felony. And to prove a felony of falsifying business documents, you need one, the underlying charge, which is falsifying business documents. And I think there's a question about whether that actually happened. Number two, to get to the felony charge, you have to have intent to defraud plus intent to commit another crime. So the prosecutor's thrown a 34 count indictment here about the same charge. And I think he's got a pretty tough road to hoe. Even if there are jurors there who aren't impartial, I think they're going to have to look at this and say, Yeah, I don't think this is a felony. If it's even a misdemeanor, probably not. That's my hope. And I think that's what justice requires.
Well, so Ron, I mean, assuming that we get to an impaneled jury, that even if there's, a couple that are impartial and they're willing to actually look at this and not just make their determination on either a preferential treatment or hatred of Donald Trump, this seems so convoluted that can the average juror look at this and even make sense of everything that Mike is talking about? Because it seems like this whole entire charge is built on several layers of fiction that really should be tossed in more of a summary judgment kind of mode rather than even proceeding to a jury.
Full disclosure, as you know, both of you know, our firm represents President Trump, not in the criminal proceedings, but in many other respects. I don't believe I would be any less revolted by the nature of these proceedings, regardless. In fact, I'm sure I wouldn't be. It is an absolute shambles, absolute humiliation for the American legal system and that of the state of New York. And you're right, Jenna. I mean, this is an indictment that should have been dismissed as a matter of law before any kind of jury selection took place. Can a jury find its way through the case the prosecution wants to make? No, the case is in and of itself irrational, inconsistent. The evidence isn't there for it. And there is going to be the best, in some respects, a conviction, if we had all the time in the world to play it out, would be best, because it would be really what we need is for a reviewing court to throw the whole thing out. But considering the way things are going, an acquittal, I think there's a very good chance of an acquittal. This is not the District of Columbia, a jurisdiction in which jurors would not hesitate to lie about their bias, and they would already be listening to opening statements today.
Yeah. And so, Mike, in practical terms, I mean, if there is a conviction, how does this bear constitutionally, if at all, one, on Trump's ability to run for president in 2024, and second, on his liberty and freedom if there is some kind of jail sentence imposed?
Well, that's a good question. And you know what, Jenna, I don't even want to get to that, because I think that that can't happen.
Nice deflection.
That may not happen. Okay, I'm just going to say it. That may not happen, if I am allowed to say that. But what I would like to point out is that this just reinforces the two tiers of justice we have in this country and the political aspect of this trial. Why, Hillary Clinton misused her email servers to transmit classified top secret information. Accountability? No. Joe Biden, bribery, corruption, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Okay, we have an impeachment proceeding 8-9 years after, or 6-7 years after the fact. Accountability? No. So if you're Democrat, one set of rules apply. If you're Donald Trump, Republican, another set of rules apply. That's got to stop.
Yeah, and Ron, to his point, I mean, Will Chamberlain, I was just talking to him on my radio program this morning, and then he was on in the first segment before you guys joined for the panel. And, it's his hypothesis that Republicans need to go as hard after Democrats and make them play by their own rules to reach some sort of, in his terms, settlement to not weaponize law enforcement and the justice system for political opponents. Do you find that persuasive?
I think everyone agrees that since the system itself everyone doesn't agree, but since the system itself is not correcting the way it ought to, because the historic trust and stability and shared values that prevented this kind of thing from happening don't work now, that some other way to disincentive this kind of corruption has to be found. And I suppose if there's a way to do it, that would be by having state attorneys general in activist conservative states to start taking similar actions against Democrat politicians. Here's my problem with it, and I don't believe Will Chamberlain would disagree. We should not be encouraging unethical abuse of the legal system.
I fully agree. It's never okay to go outside of the margins of the law or the Constitution, even if the Democrats are. But we'll be right back with more.